Berlin Wall Piece by Sam Shepard, from the book Great Dream of Heaven. My dad knows absolutely nothing about the 80s. I have to interview him for my 7th grade social studies class, and he knows nothing. He says he can't remember anything about the cars, or the hair, or the clothes, or the music, or anything. He says the economy sucked, and that was a Republican thing, but other than that, nothing stands out for him. He says the most significant thing about the 80s was when he first met my mother and when me and my sister were both born. Those two things. That's it. When I tell him it's not supposed to be about personal stuff, he says, what else is there? I tell him I need stuff about style and fads and what was going on in the country at the time, and he says none of that has anything to do with reality, that reality is an internal affair, and all the rest of the stuff is just superficial and a lie, like the news. He says the news is all lies, and the reason it's so popular is that it sells itself as all truth, and people believe it because they rather believe in a lie. The truth is too much for them to swallow. That's what he says. I tell him this is supposed to be a simple assignment about the decade of the 80s, not about reality and the news. But he says you can't exclude the question of reality, that the question of reality supersedes all other questions about hair and car and music and things like that. He says he can't even remember living through the 80s, and that maybe he wasn't even alive back then, but then he had to have been, he says, because he remembers meeting my mother, and me and my sister were both born back then. He repeats that. My dad's fucking crazy. He is. I didn't realize it for a long time, but he is. My sister knows more about the 80s than my dad does, and she's only a year or so older than me. She's in the 9th grade. She knows all kinds of things. Don't ask me how. Like the way they used to wear their pants back then in this weird tapered style where they actually folded the pant leg inside their zip-up boots. And the girls wore ripped-up fishnet stockings and cheap white cotton gloves trying to imitate Madonna, who I guess was the bomb in music back then, or Michael Jackson, who just started bleaching his black skin, or Bob Seger, who I thought was only known for that dumb Like a Rock Chevy commercial. And then on top of that, she knows all kinds of political stuff, like Russia not being Russia anymore, and the Berlin Wall coming down. And I ask her how she knows things like that, and she says because she was there. Yeah, right, I say. And she says, yeah, I can prove it. And she runs upstairs to her bedroom and comes back down with a chunk of painted concrete about the size of a cheeseburger and sets it down on the kitchen counter right in front of me and my dad. What's that? I say. And she says, that's a piece of the Berlin Wall. It is, my dad says, and gets very excited about it. That's exactly what it is. Isn't that incredible? He picks it up and turns it over, feeling the weight of it, as though it might be from another planet or something. When did you go to the Berlin Wall, honey? My sister looks at him, dumbfounded. Don't you remember? My sister says. I went with Mom and Aunt Amy. I don't remember that, my dad says. How old were you? He remembers nothing. Like he's losing his mind. How could he not remember something like that? His own daughter going to the Berlin Wall. He's not that old to be losing his mind, but he is. Where was I? My dad says. You must have been home, my sister says. I must have, he says. I ask my sister how she got a piece of the Berlin Wall, and she says they were driving through Berlin at the time they were tearing the wall down, and the workers were just giving away pieces of it, handing it through the car windows. She said it was like a party. She was 3 years old, and these big hands of hairy men were coming through the windows, handing them chunks of rock and concrete as though it were cake, and she had no idea what it was all about. I'm staring at the chunk of cement on the kitchen counter. One side is smooth and flat, and painted flashy turquoise and purple with a skinny yellow stripe cutting down the middle. It looks like spray paint, maybe graffiti. The other side is broken and rough, And you can see the fragments of things that they made the concrete out of, small, smooth stones that look like they could have come out of somewhere deep in the woods, and sharp gravel mixed in with this chalky-looking cement that doesn't look American at all, and then these tiny, glittering particles. When you run your finger along the edge of it, it makes the sound of glass more than stone. My sister offers to let me take the piece of the Berlin Wall to school and show it around in my class, which is a very generous offer for her, I think. Then my dad picks up the heavy chunk of the Berlin Wall and drops it into a Ziploc bag, and when I ask him why he's doing that, he says so it doesn't get lost. He says it's very important that it doesn't get lost or stolen because it's a real, live piece of modern history. What does he care? He's not even sure he was alive back then, and now he's calling this piece of concrete alive. He's not making any sense at all. He takes out a big roll of silver plumber's tape from a drawer and tears a piece off with his teeth. He sticks the strip of tape on the Ziploc bag and then takes a black magic marker and writes Berlin Wall piece, like it's some kind of museum label or something. There, he says. That ought to do it. He's totally nuts. My sister's doing her homework all this time, but keeps coming up with stuff about the 80s and fires it at me as she's working, as though her mind is able to split right down the middle and do two things at once. She's totally brilliant, I think. There was some volcano out west in Washington that erupted, she said. It erupted and kept on erupting off and on for the rest of the year. That was in the 80s, wasn't it, Dad? I don't know why she's asking him. How would he know? I don't know, my dad says, as he wipes black ants off the counter with a wet sponge. He doesn't try to step on them, he just wipes them onto the floor and lets them crawl away. Why don't you kill them? I ask my dad. I like ants, he says. They remind me of summer and hot places. We always had ants when I was growing up. He says this as though he was talking about puppies or guinea pigs. Oh, and they discovered AIDS, my sister blurts out. That's when they first discovered the AIDS virus, was the 80s. She's on a roll now. I don't know how her mind works. It's a mystery to me. Like, she can scroll stuff up like she's looking at it on a green screen or something. AIDS? Where did she come up with that off the top of her head? And Marvin Gaye got shot by his father, didn't he, she says. Suddenly, my dad stops cold in the middle of the kitchen, like he's been hit in the back of the head by a board or something. That's right, my dad says. I remember that. You do? I say, and I'm looking straight at him, standing there with the sponge hanging down from his hand, dripping on the floor, and he's starting out across the kitchen without seeing me or my sister or anything, but as though he's trying to nail down this picture of Marvin Gaye in his mind, all shot in the head and bloody from some picture in the news back then that he hates. I remember that very clearly, he says. I was in California. It was 1984, the summer or spring of 1984, and it was very hot. Marvin Gaye was killed by his father, and his father was a reverend, wasn't he? I think he was. A man of the church. And he shot his son in the head over something. Over something to do with women, I think. Something about a woman, wasn't it? He turns to my sister, who doesn't realize he's asking her a direct question and just continues on with her head down in her book, working hard on her homework. Wasn't it something to do with a woman? He says to her again. My sister finally looks up at him and sees that he's talking to her. She stares at him, but you can see she's thinking about some math problem. I don't know, Dad, she says, and her eyes go back down into her books. He looks at me, sort of searching for a second. I don't know the answer. How am I supposed to know the answer? I wasn't even born yet when that happened. He looks out across the kitchen again, toward the dark windows. It's funny I'd remember that, he says. And then he tosses the sponge into the sink and walks out onto the screen porch and stands there for a long while, looking out at the lawn and the maple tree. Spring peepers are chirping from the pond down the hill. I pick up the Ziploc bag with the piece of the Berlin Wall inside and hold it up to the light. It's just a chunk of concrete. Don't lose that, my sister says without looking up. How can I lose it? I say. It's labeled.